Webster says, the center is the core, the middle place about which a body is in equilibrium. The center is a source, from which an influence or process takes its origin. For 40 years, Detroit's Jewish community has had such a core, such a source, and tonight we celebrate its 40th anniversary. But it all began much earlier. Let me tell you the story. Once upon a time, at the turn of the century, tree-shaded Detroit was a town of 300,000, of whom 5,000 were Jews. The forebears of the center were already established. The YMHA, Young Men's Hebrew Association, signed its first bylaws in 1891, espousing a program of physical fitness, Jewish learning, social cultivation, and a bureau for securing employment for deserving young men. Had you attended its first meeting on a windy March evening 74 years ago, you would have heard a speech on the values of library by Magnus Butzel Esquire, chairman of the Detroit Library Commission, and you would have heard selections from the Zither by Mrs. A.W. Ehrman. Can you recognize the ancestral characteristics of our center? The Self-Help Circle assisted children of the Russian immigration with classes in home arts, cooking, and deportment. There was a Hebrew Ladies' Sewing Society. In 1899, the United Jewish Charities were formed, and in 1903, when the Hana Schloss Memorial Building became its headquarters, the charities offered services that facilitated Americanization and aided the economically underprivileged to help themselves. Its Jewish Institute wing, dedicated in 1908, made it possible for these activities to multiply and flourish. Babies attended the Ida Ginsberg Day Nursery. Classes in arithmetic, civics, physical fitness, piano, drama, and manual training were set up for the youngsters, and there were Boy Scouts, too. As the years passed, these educational programs took on new character, adding to subject matter experiments in self-government and democratic procedures. Out of the classes grew clubs. First and most famous, the Tri-Squares, which developed from Dr. Lane's manual training class. Does this sound like the center program? From one who lived it in person, let's hear what it was like to be a youngster at Hana Schloss.
Well, being a youngster at the Hana Schloss was the greatest. Maybe not the way kids would feel about it today, but back in those days, we had no place to go. All the Jewish families lived in a radius of a few blocks, and I tell you, without the Hana Schloss building, we kids would have been lost. The only thing available to us was an already overcrowded play school area and a few empty lots to play in. That was different for the girls in those days. They didn't need much room. All they wanted to do was talk about boys. And I guess that's about the only thing that hasn't changed. But as to what has changed, I remember every Saturday night we had to take a bath whether we needed it or not. This wasn't exactly a simple matter. Bathing required 2 tubs, one for our feet and one for the rest of us. Well, in 1915, a great new innovation was installed at the Hana Schloss building. A long pipe with a piece of metal high above your head, out of which came both cold and warm water. Showers, indeed, were a strange innovation, and it certainly beat the 2 tubs. But when Saturday night came around, go explain to your Yiddish mother that you already bathed at the Hana Schloss building from a pipe with holes in it. Hot and cold water, no less. I can remember what she said. Rednischkeit, Narrischkeit, geh wasch sich. All my friends' mothers seemed to have the same kind of life. The one thing they all had in common was daily drudgery. I remember how I envied those kids whose mothers took English classes at the Hana Schloss building. As a youngster, I recall feeling that more important than if your mother could speak better English or not was the fact that she at least did get out of the house a little. become part of the center of Jewish life in our small, restricted community. I guess another thing that hasn't changed are the Yiddish mamas. They all wanted us to be doctors, lawyers, a professional man. So our mothers were always nagging us to join the Philomathic Debating Club, with high hopes that maybe we'd amount to something. As far as we were concerned, that was for sissies. A lot of the kids felt like I did. What did you need to know about debating to help you put a ball in a basket? Basketball was our life. However, every Tuesday we had to suffer the pain of relinquishing the basketball court to the Kadimas, a girls' basketball team. We boys were banned because the girls played in their bloomers. There was something else in our lives besides basketball. A man who probably had the most profound influence on most of our lives, Fred Butzel. We couldn't figure out what would be worse. If you were caught stealing apples from the farmer's horse and wagon as it wended its way down High Street to the market, what your parents might do to you, or what Fred Butzel might do. I remember some of our meetings. I object to the objection on the amendment to the motion. You can't amend the amendment on the objection to the amendment to the motions. And only one man could solve this kind of ticklish problem. Fred Butzel. What was he? Omnipotent human being to be feared. Omnipotent human being to be respected. Friend of any man or boy in trouble. These and many other images did Fred Butzel convey as his presence was seen and felt everywhere in the building. I can't separate the institution from the man, and I can only say, hoping that I won't hurt the feelings of either one of them, that they influenced and changed my life.
Jewish Institute program went north with a Jewish population to a building at 579 East Philadelphia. No great edifice, but a house filled with activity. The YMHA, which had been reorganized once or twice and had dissolved when its members marched off to the First World War, was organized again after they returned. And something new was added. The Jewish Women's Club, forerunner of the Detroit section, National Council of Jewish Women, in 1921 established a residency for young working women. Through the good offices of David Brown, the building was financed by money contributed to the war chest and available after the war to deserving community programs. Activities and classes provided for the young women residents became so popular that the program developed into the YWHA, the Young Women's Hebrew Association, under the aegis of the Jewish Welfare Association. Naturally enough, the girls involved attracted boys. There were dances, theatricals, and concerts, and some 1,300 young people filled the Rowena Street house. Does this have a familiar ring? 1926 was a very good year, the year of Charleston, the Varsity Drag, and the formation of the Jewish Centers Association as the agency for leisure time informal educational programs within the new Jewish Welfare Federation. The Community Fund undertook its deficit maintenance budget, but all capital costs were the responsibility of the Jewish community. Milton M. Alexander, first president of a distinguished line, sought better quarters for the center program. We moved to what had been the church house of the Methodist Tabernacle on Melbourne Street, a block or so from Woodward. It was a warren of long hallways with steps up and steps down into big, dark rooms, but it increased our space. In addition to serving youngsters, programs were developing for their parents. A mothers and babies camp was a success. And burgeoning with figures that still go strong were the mothers' clubs, attracting hundreds of women. They had been started in 1922, with Mary Kaplan as their guiding light. What was their purpose so many years ago, and what is it now? Let's hear from a member of the Mothers Club. She was there when it all began.
Who knows when it began? Maybe it was 1915, maybe 1918, I don't know. Maybe even 1921. But I do remember I lived on Oakland Avenue, and somewhere a long way off was a place called the Hana Schloss building. It was almost like taking a big trip to get there, but I remember attending some concerts and lectures there. Most of us who lived on Oakland Avenue were newcomers to America. We didn't know the language, and we spent all of our time in the kitchen, cleaning, taking care of the children. Most of us in those days had big families. I had 4 children. My friends had more. My neighbor across the street had 12, and this wasn't unusual. Although life was hard in those days, life was pleasant too. We were poor, but we had plenty of joy, and believe me, sorrow too. My husband worked hard. He left the house early in the morning and didn't come home till late at night. We women did more than our share to try to make it a little easier when our husbands came home. I remember dragging those heavy ash cans from the basement up a flight of stairs to put in front of the house for pickup. And into this simple life of ours came this lady, Mary Kaplan. We all vaguely knew her as someone associated with the Hana Schloss building downtown. How do I explain this wonderful woman to you? It was as if she swept us off our feet. And before we knew it, we were all meeting every Saturday in the Moore School at Alger in Oakland. This was the beginning of a new world for us, and this was the beginning of the Oakland Mothers Club. Our dues were 20 cents a year. Miss Kaplan had other ladies at the Moore School on those Saturday afternoons. And while we were listening to a lecture or concert, some people who worked with Miss Kaplan took our little children into another room of the school and amused them for the afternoon. To sit there and listen to beautiful music or a good speaker and not have little ones squirming on your lap or crying or tugging at your dress was really something. We were afraid it was too good to last and that Miss Kaplan was really up to something else. What did she want from us? We soon found out. Learn the American language. Become American citizens, too, over and over again. Miss Kaplan also taught us that table manners were just as important as learning the language of our new country. Don't leave your seat to get a piece of cake. She taught us that the proper thing is to say, "Please pass the plate." And it wasn't long before we Oakland mothers were learning the English language. Mary Kaplan was a good person. I might sound too dramatic, but it was dramatic, and we all felt the same way about Miss Kaplan. She gave us life. It was Mary who took us out of the kitchen and opened our eyes and our hearts to a new way of life. You know, it seems funny, but sometimes I can't remember things that happened to me yesterday, yet the memory of days at the Moore School are so vivid and alive. It's as if it just happened yesterday. I can hardly tell you the joy we felt when the first one of us became an American citizen. To finally be able to read your first English words, and to know because of these new changes in our lives, we women were no longer second-class citizens. Who can ever forget these moments in one's lifetime?
Now it's 1929, and Milford Stern is president. We're at a big moment of truth. The YWHA and the Jewish Centers Association met with Mr. Lewis Kraft of the Jewish Welfare Association, parent body of both these agencies, and worked out a plan to join together to form the Jewish Community Center. In July of 1929, the plan went into operation, and the program cost was met by the Detroit section, the National Council of Jewish Women. Thus, our 3 serving agencies became one: a center for adults, the young and the children of Detroit's Jewish community, a place to meet, a place to learn, a place to play, and a place to grow. More had happened to our center than the growth in size and numbers, more even than a unification of the group work facilities of our community. Had you noticed? What began as education for the underprivileged and Americanization for the immigrants was by now an enrichment service for all who sought it. Art and music, physical development, club life, literature, Jewish learning and drama. These were the substances. And the purpose, to help each individual to fill out his potentialities within the group that attracted him. 1929 began in prosperity. The Jewish Community Center negotiated for the old Fraser Farm property at Woodward and Holbrook. The plan was to use the house and apartment building already on the site and to incorporate it eventually into the center building, which was to be provided through a contribution from the Carey Sittig Cohen estate and a generous gift from Mrs. Aaron DeRoy as a memorial to her husband. By 1932, when Nate Shapiro was president, and all these negotiations were ready for completion, prosperity had vanished. Health and welfare agencies across the city were cutting their programs. But not our center. 4 days before the banks closed, that dismal depression in February, the center closed its deal on the Holbrook property. Through the good offices of our leaders and directors of the Michigan Bank, the center went ahead with its purchase. Why did we go on when so many were forced to turn back during this era when Meyer Prentice and Judge Charles Rubiner were presidents? Was it that there was faith in the center's validity as a core for Jewish identification, as a force for meaningful Jewish community life? In 1939, with Henry Myers as Community Center president, the enlarged new building was dedicated. In its new quarters, the center opened new avenues of interest and activity. A library which included important Hebrew and Yiddish items. A music department with a qualified professional director. A number of dramatics groups to meet the interests of adults as well as juniors. A health club for men and a health club for women. A dance department with lecture demonstrations as well as classes. Courses and lectures on subjects of general and Jewish interest. The Center Forum, and a series in the Jewish arts. The next years were filled with tension and trouble for the whole world. The Hitler Holocaust, the Second World War. Guided by Presidents Mrs. Samuel Glogauer and Hyman Broder, the Center, as an agency for replenishment of the spirit, found much to do. It worked for the refugees, providing socials, outlets, and employment opportunities in cooperation with the resettlement service for the many who came to Detroit. In 1940, we furnished headquarters for the Detroit Army and Navy Committee of the Jewish Welfare Board. If you were in town as a serviceman during the war, you'll never forget the bagels and lox at those weekly Sunday brunches, or the lovely hostesses, of whom 500 were recruited by Mrs. Julian Krolik and trained and supervised by Mrs. Samuel Glogauer and Mrs. Joseph M. Welt. Tonight, there's a veteran of these parties to tell us of the center during the war.
I was in the Army in the early 40s. I was a soldier, and I was a fighter, and I was tough. I was only 21 years old. They told us we had to grow up fast, and I suppose we did. But let me assure you, this toughness was all on the outside. Most of us were a bunch of homesick kids. I was stationed at Selfridge Field, and when we were off duty, we'd go into town and really live it up. Date the prettiest girls we could find and dance the jitterbug till we almost collapsed. Or take in a downtown movie, the Fox Theater or the Michigan. Or maybe just find a nearby bar and drink with our buddies, swapping war stories with each other, real or otherwise. But then came those moments which come to all of us. At the end of the day, you're in bed and just lie there before falling off. Those were the times when you didn't feel so tough, or feel much like a soldier for that matter. I remember I just felt like the kid I was, and thought about school. Glen Falls, New York, that's where I was from. And my family, friends, and my best girl. Man, I sure was lonely. Even my old Hebrew teacher, Mr. Finkelstein, would have looked good to me. I sure gave that guy a rough time. I even felt a little sorry for some of the crazy things I pulled on him. Well, I could go on and on with all that came to me in those terribly lonely hours of darkness. But I was dead tired, and sleep soon came to me. But nothing to remind me of home. One day, one of my buddies told me about the weekly Sunday brunches served at the Jewish Community Center. Well, maybe this doesn't sound exactly like something to send a guy into orbit, but when you're lonely and looking for something to remind you of home, Sunday morning bagels and lox sure sounded like the next best thing to your mother's homemade chicken soup. I don't know where it all started, but bagels and lox on Sunday has become so traditional in most Jewish homes that we sometimes forget it wasn't handed down from Mount Sinai. Well, I started going to those brunches, and I'll always remember those wonderful women. Many of them had sons in the service, too. And they treated us just like kings. Or should I say generals? They just couldn't do enough for us. Now, don't misunderstand. During the war, there were a lot of wonderful people who did everything possible and more to help servicemen feel at home. Let's face it, before I enlisted in the service, a big part of my life was the big Friday night family dinners. Homemade chicken soup, gefilte fish, and roast chicken. And every Sunday morning, bagels and lox with all the hot coffee a guy could drink. That was home. And when I think back on my war experiences more than 20 years ago, I also remember those terrific gals, the lovely hostesses at the Jewish Community Center, who on Sunday mornings really brought home a little closer to us.
Branches were the style in the 40s and 50s, with Samuel Rubiner, Morris Garvett, and Harvey Goldman leading the center during this period. Center programs operated at Fenkell, Davison, the D.W. Simons Building, the Esther Berman Building, and the 12th Street Council Center, so that all who could enjoy its rich variety were served. In 1955, when Jacob Kiden was elected president, the 10 Mile Road branch was opened. In February of 1959, with Samuel Frankel as president, after years of planning, our beautiful center here at Curtis and Myers became our new building. Charles Gershenson succeeded Frankel as president, and today, Milton J. Miller is carrying on the traditions of the center. What goes on here? What emanated beyond to each of us? The joys of self-expression, of companionship for every age, of stretching our minds to know, our bodies to strength, our hearts to learn from other hearts. Among major events this very year, Omnibus, the Children's Theater Program, Center Theater, the 26th season of the Center Symphony, the 14th Annual Book Fair, and also Town Hall on Crucial Issues and the Jewish Parents Institute. See it now. Look at these pictures of our current activities. The Jewish Music Festival, children visiting the Sukkah, a dance class, a senior adults meeting, teens and tweens on a bicycle outing, Mr. Levine entertaining the senior adults, and members of the senior adults participating in a holiday program. This is our center. For 40 years, a source of enriched Jewish identification for all of us, from every part of town, with every shade of opinion. We, the Jewish Community Center, are a uniquely American Jewish institution, responding to the needs of our diversified society. From settlement house to community core, this has been our development. We rejoice in the leaders, staff, and volunteers whose spirit, generosity, faith, and energy have brought us to this day. We rejoice in one another, we who meet here for renewal, and we look ahead to our next chapters with joy.